Hello and welcome to Political Science 101 online. Today we're going to talk about the Constitution. We are on Chapter 2 and we are going to go through the chapter, and then later we're going to talk about different parts of it in another lecture. So the Constitution, you have your learning outcomes at the bottom of page 24 to point out some of the influences on the American political tradition in the colonial years. Explain why the American colonies rebelled against Britain. Describe the structure of government established by the Articles of Confederation and some strengths and weaknesses of the Articles. List some of the major compromises made by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, and discuss Federalist and Anti-Federalist positions on ratifying the Constitution. Summarize the Constitution's major principles of government and describe how the Constitution can be amended. The first thing I wanted to talk about was it is really important to understand that the first part of the American Revolution was actually not a war for independence. And the reason for that is because the colonists really just wanted to be recognized as a voice and be listened to. So it was not really, they did not want to break from England at the beginning. Then after about a year, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, they did want to break. They'd had it, there was enough, they didn't want to remain part of England. They made that decision. So then it becomes the War of Independence. So there is a difference between the Revolutionary War and the War of Independence, and it's when that break was made by the colonists. Okay, was the United States meant to be a Christian nation? That is really an interesting debate that they open up the chapter with. It really was supposed to be about religious freedom, and that is really, I think, important to be reminded of as we get into the elections upcoming and that sort of thing, because people were being persecuted and treated poorly in England, and that's why they decided to come over in the first place. And then, you want to make sure throughout history you find these contradictions, and you need to make sure to look at different things and say, okay, there's a contradiction here. And you'll find several contradictions throughout history. It's just the best thing to do is to acknowledge them, to learn from them, and to make sure that they aren't carried out further. Okay, it does make a point, something that I actually hadn't thought about, that the Declaration of Independence never refers to Christ. And actually this week, you will be reading two primary source documents: the Articles of Confederation, which were in place for 10 years but very weak, and then of course the Declaration of Independence, which was the break from England. Okay, those are the ones we're going to be reading this week. So then you have, your 2 points, yes, America is a Christian nation, or the Christian nation idea would violate the rights because it was founded on freedom, and it does have some really good things on either side. Now, what is really interesting is Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, and I believe it's in your Crash Course U.S. History video, where John Green goes deeply into Thomas Paine's life, and actually he was not a Christian at all, even though he knew his audience when he wrote the pamphlets on Common Sense, and he often wrote to people who he would write biblical stories, weave them in and out of his writing so that he would convince his audience. So he was very brilliant. He knew his audience. He might not have believed it, but he knew his audience, because he often referred to King George as a lot like the Pharaoh of Egypt and being oppressive and that sort of thing. But it is interesting, at the end of his life, there was a huge cost for Thomas Paine not being a Christian and such an environment of religious you were expected and had to be. And he only had 8 people attend his funeral, and here he was. His writings on the Common Sense pamphlets actually sparked the Revolutionary War and got colonists to come together. Really is one of the turning points that really brought colonists into the Revolutionary War. The oldest constitution is very interesting. From our last chapter, they talked about the Magna Carta in 1215, which was given to King John over in England. That was the first kind of limiting of power where everyone's under the law. And then something else that they brought up is that the United States Constitution is the oldest one that is still being used. So that was really interesting on page 26. You have the different compacts that were signed, the Mayflower Compact, which was also kind of setting up government, having some sort of rules to follow. That compact was drawn up on the Mayflower as they were coming over. And people signed it and were promising to obey the laws of the land. Okay, and as there were more colonies, each one had its own constitution many times. And individual rights was beginning to be something that was popular. It's really interesting in history. Individual rights is really not a thing. Not a thing at all. This is newer. Caring about the individuals. There really were no individual rights in the Middle Ages. It was about the elite. It was about the hierarchy, the lords, the knights, the vassals, and the serfs. Really, they were just kind of like the masses, and no one really felt that they were valuable enough to have individual rights. So it is interesting that the Pennsylvania Charter of 1701 establishes principles that were later expressed in the U.S. Constitution as a Bill of Rights. So Pennsylvania was given that credit, and it's really interesting that that group of people got together and said, we need a Bill of Rights for individuals. So that's interesting. The Bill of Rights is really for that. Okay. What's really neat about the colonies in the U.S. is that they were small and they had a lot of participation in those colonial governments and had a lot of political experience that a lot of colonies did not get. The British Empire had many, many, many colonies that they did not allow to practice equality. Because a colonial government, it sounds like a wonderful thing, but actually it's a parent and a child relationship. And the problem with colonialism, whether it's colonies in India or colonies in the Caribbean, they would always say, oh, you're not ready to rule yourself. Oh, you're not ready to rule yourself. So it was almost like these colonies never grew up. So the American colonies demanded their rights, had the Revolutionary War. And then when England was no longer, they were not able to get along or to reason with them, they demanded their independence. And they already knew how to use their political system against them. And that's really what the Common Sense Papers by Thomas Paine really kind of bring up. Here's your political system, and here is how you're being contradictory, and how you're being really a hypocrite. But then you'll find that also in American history, because as we read the Declaration of Independence, we'll find that all men were not created equal. If you were this color or that color, or an American Indian, or this type of immigrant, you did not have the same rights. And we still have that going on today. Several factions of people are not given the same rights. Okay. I told you the difference between the Revolutionary War and War of Independence. Taxation without representation. The biggest problem that the Americans had was the British fought the French and Indian War against the French, and they spent a lot of money, and they wanted someone to pay for it, so they decided that the American colonies would foot the bill, and there was nothing they could say about it. And that's where the taxation without representation came in, because they wanted to use the Americans' colonies to have someone pay for the war. And they did not want to. And they had their empire was vast and very expensive. And so they wanted they wanted to use someone to pay the bills, and didn't want their own people to foot the bill. And it talks about the Stamp Act, and of course the Tea Party, and the boycotts that came are very, very interesting. The boycotts are really interesting because all of a sudden you have people who are loyal to the English government are still dressing in their aristocratic cloth and dresses from England. They're still buying them from England, but the patriots were boycotting textiles from England. So they were now having to go back in time, spinning, weaving, making their own clothes, and you could visibly see a difference between the fashion of the patriots. They looked a little befuddled, a little not as prim and proper and aristocratic, but then you could see the Tories and the people who were not rebelling against England, and they were looking quite posh and in the European best. So you began to see a visible break in politics, which today you can't really look at someone and say, okay, you're this party or you're this party. But at this time you could, because women actually were a huge part of the protest, the Daughters of Liberty. Okay. I love that they give, Thomas Paine such amazing credit for his rousing arguments. Really made people think and ask why and ask logical questions. And we may need to read some of his common sense, just because he's a fantastic, passionate writer. Okay, let's see. So you had the First Continental Congress meeting, a petition with King George explaining their grievances. There was a lot of harassment of people who were not taking up the cause of the Americans, and they were actually put in local papers. And can you imagine people being blacklisted because of their beliefs? Very sad. Thomas Paine's story is so intriguing, and I really encourage you to watch the John Green Crash Course U.S. Histories that I'll post, because they give some extra information, and also they're just fun to watch because John Green does it in such a fabulous way. But he also was a former tax collector for the British government, and he was let go. So Ben Franklin kind of got him to come over to the United States, and so he is kind of an insider writing about the practices in when he writes Common Sense. Okay, and the significance of the Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4th, 1776. Today is July 3rd, 2016. So very interesting that we're on the same lesson. Thomas Jefferson wrote most of the document. Really would like to get my hands on the original, because I have heard that he wrote within the original, he was blaming King George III for all slavery, which later you find that Thomas Jefferson was quite the slave owner, but the Continental Congress made him take out some different things. They edited it.
It's 5 o'clock.
But I would love to see the original of that. I need to get my hands on that, because that would be really interesting, or at least put it up for extra reading or resources. Okay. From colonies to states, states had constitutions as they were merging and growing, and they had their own, each state had a constitution, so this constitution ideology was not really new, so they had some practice in that. And Pennsylvania and Georgia had a unicameral, a one-chamber legislature, so they had a lot of this going on and growing in that. Okay. Wonderful question on page 31. The American colonists did not have the right to elect members of the British Parliament. That is really interesting, because they're not really able to be represented. And American history may have been different, and it asks you how, if the British would have actually allowed that. All right.